Thrown out at 19, she hid in an empty ice house. Torsten Kvama, who had survived 9 Dakota winters, told her, "Sleep one night in that ice house and they'll carry you out stiff before dawn." She had $9, no one to take her, and no way to survive the winter. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in hours. But 4 months earlier, Marit Tveit had never sealed a room against the cold in her life. She had arrived in Dakota Territory 2 years earlier, in the summer of 1885, riding beside her father on a wagon that creaked with everything they owned. Marit Tveit was 17 then, thin-shouldered and quiet, watching the prairie grass bend under a wind that never seemed to stop. Her mother had died in Minnesota the previous winter. Her older brother Knut had married and stayed behind. Her father Halvor said the lake country was good. He said there was land. He said they would start again. The settlement at Lake Kampeska was not a town yet, not really. Watertown sat a few miles east, growing fast enough that men talked about rail lines and county seats and futures measured in decades rather than seasons. But the lakeshore, where Halvor staked his claim, was quieter. Patched cabins, frame houses half-finished, Norwegian voices mixing with German and English in the general store. The lake itself stretched flat and silver under the August sun, and Marit thought it looked like a held breath. Halvor Tveit was not a wealthy man. He was not even a lucky one. But he knew how to work, and he taught his daughter the same. By the second winter, she could split kindling faster than most boys her age. She could bank a stove fire to last until morning. She could darn socks until her fingers bled, and then darn 3 more pairs before she stopped. These were not skills anyone praised. They were simply what survival required. The cabin they built together was modest, part log, part frame, chinked with mud and straw that cracked every spring and needed patching every fall. 1 room for sleeping, 1 for everything else. A cast-iron stove that ate wood like a hungry animal. A root cellar dug into the slope behind the house that flooded every time the snow melted too fast. But it was theirs. Her father's name was on the papers. And for 2 years, that had been enough. Then came the threshing accident. It happened in September of 1887, on a neighbor's farm where Halvor had gone to help with the harvest. The machine caught his shirt. The gears pulled him in. By the time the other men stopped the mechanism, 3 of his ribs were crushed, and something inside him was bleeding that no one could reach. He died 4 days later, in the cabin he had built, with Marit holding his hand and the autumn wind rattling the poorly fitted window frame. She was 19 years old. She had $9 in coin, 1 good quilt her mother had made, 1 lamp, and a brother who arrived for the funeral with a ledger book under his arm. Knut Tveit had grown thick in the 2 years since Marit had seen him. His shoulders had widened. His beard had filled in. He wore a coat that looked almost new, and he carried himself like a man who had learned to measure everything by what it could be sold for. He did not embrace his sister when he arrived. He walked through the cabin slowly, touching the stove, the table, the chest where their father had kept the account book. His wife, Randi, stayed outside with their toddler son, Arne, her face pinched against the September chill. "The debts are worse than I thought," Knut said, not looking at Marit. He was examining the stove's condition, running a finger along the seam where the pipe met the roof. "Tools, credit at the store, what he owed Lindgren for the seed." "I can work," Marit said. "I can pay them." Knut laughed. It was not a kind sound. "With what? You have no team, no plow, no husband." He turned to face her then, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Not grief, calculation. "The cabin is the only thing worth anything. I'll take over the debts, assume the improvements. Randy and I will winter here. You can find a place." "Find a place?" Marit's voice came out smaller than she intended. "This is my home. This is property. Canute pulled the ledger from beneath his arm and opened it to a page covered in their father's careful handwriting. And property goes to whoever can manage it. You're 19, Marit. No skills that matter. No money, no prospects. What did you think would happen? She thought of the 2 years of work, the mud she had mixed with her own hands to fill the wall cracks, the kindling she had split until her palms bled, the root cellar she had dug alongside her father, shovel by shovel, while he told her stories about Norway and the farm they had left behind. I thought I would stay, she said. Then you thought wrong. Canute closed the ledger. I'll give you 3 days to find somewhere else. That's more than fair. The 3 days passed like water through a cracked bucket. Marit tried the boarding house in Watertown first. The owner, a German woman with arms like fence posts, looked her up and down and named a price that would have eaten her $9 in 2 weeks. The room was barely larger than a closet, shared with another girl who worked at the laundry, and it had no stove of its own. She tried the Lindgren farm next. Eric Lindgren had been her father's friend, or something close to it. He listened to her request with his hat in his hands, and then he shook his head slowly. I would if I could, he said, but we're full up already. My wife's sister came from Minnesota with her 3 boys. There's no room, Marit. I'm sorry. She tried 2 more farms. A widow who had no space. A bachelor who had too much interest in having her stay for other reasons. She walked back to the lakeshore as the sun went down, her feet aching, her chest tight with something that felt like drowning on dry land. The cheapest shelter she could imagine was a claim shanty. She had seen them scattered across the prairie, rough shacks of green lumber and tar paper, built fast and cheap by settlers who needed something, anything, to prove they were working their land. But even the most basic version required $15 in materials. More if you wanted it to actually keep out the wind, and the winter stories about those shanties were not stories of survival. They were stories of families who woke to find snow blown through every crack, boards that dried and shrank until you could see daylight between them, wind that howled through walls like they were made of paper. She did not have $15. She had 9, and winter was 6 weeks away. On the 3rd day, Canute set her trunk on the porch. It was not a large trunk. It held her clothes, her mother's quilt, her lamp, a comb, 2 books, and a small wooden box that contained everything else she owned. Canute stood in the doorway while she carried it down the steps, and he did not offer to help. Where will you go? Randy asked from behind him. Her voice carried something that might have been concern, though it was hard to tell with Randy. She was a careful woman. She calculated before she spoke. I'll find something, Marit said. You should find a husband. Canute's tone was practical, not cruel. That made it worse. A woman alone out here doesn't last. Someone will take you. You're not ugly. Marit lifted her trunk and walked down the path without answering. She could feel them watching her until she rounded the bend in the track, and then she was alone. The lake shore stretched out before her, flat and colorless under the September sky. The water was still open, but there was a chill in the air that spoke of ice to come. In 2 months, maybe less, that water would freeze solid enough to drive a wagon across. In 3 months, the temperature would drop to 20 below, 30 below, and anyone without a tight roof and a working stove would simply stop breathing. She had nowhere to go. She had no one who would take her. And the math of her situation was brutally simple. $9, 1 quilt, 1 lamp, and 6 weeks until the cold came to kill her. That was when she saw the ice house. It sat on the slope above the lake, half banked into the hill, its loading door facing the water. The building had been part of a commercial ice-cutting operation that had failed 3 years earlier, bad management according to her father, and a partner who had run off with the cash box. Now it stood abandoned, its timbers weathering to gray, its padlock rusted but still holding. Marit had been inside that building twice before. Once as a girl, carrying bread to the men who were cutting and stacking lake ice in July. Once more the following summer, when her father had borrowed tools from the foreman before the operation shut down. She remembered the feel of it, stepping out of the brutal heat and into a space that felt like shade made solid. Cold air settling around her shoulders like water, the men laughing at her expression. She stood at the bottom of the slope now, looking up at the building, and a thought crossed her mind that made no sense at all. A wall that keeps July out. The men had explained it to her that first summer. Double walls filled with sawdust. No windows to let in heat. Doors that sealed tight. A drain to carry melt water away. All of it designed for one purpose, to keep cold inside when everything outside was burning hot. Marit climbed the slope. Her boots slipped in the dry grass, and she had to catch herself twice before she reached the loading door. The padlock was rusted, almost solid, but rust made metal brittle. She found a rock. 3 hard strikes, and the shackle snapped. She pulled the door open and stepped inside. The air hit her first. Not cold, exactly. It was September, and whatever ice had been stored here was long gone, but still. Settled. The kind of air that had not moved in months. The building was larger than she remembered, and stranger. The main floor was divided into 2 sections. A deeper vault where the ice had been stored, accessible through plank hatches, and a smaller upper room to the side that had been used for tools and staging. Both spaces shared the same thick walls, timber on the outside, timber on the inside, and something between them that absorbed sound like cloth. She moved through the upper room slowly, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Old sawdust in drifts against the walls, mouse droppings scattered across the planks. Their rotten sacks that had once held something she could not identify. But beneath the neglect, she could see the bones of the place. The door that sealed tight against its frame. The walls that were thicker than any cabin she had ever been in. The ceiling that was low enough to trap whatever warmth might rise. Marit pressed her palm against the interior wall and felt something she had not expected. Not warmth, nothing here was warm, but the absence of the sharp, biting cold that seeped through every wall she had ever known. Her father had taught her how buildings fail, cracks in the chinking, gaps around the door frame, places where wind found its way in and stole heat faster than any stove could replace it. This building had been designed against those failures, not for comfort, for preservation. Nor she thought about July ice lasting into August. She thought about men stacking frozen blocks in a room that held its breath against summer. She thought about walls that could stop heat from getting in. And then she thought, what if they could stop heat from getting out? Torsten Kvama found her there an hour later. He was 61 years old, with a face that looked like it had been carved from weathered oak, and hands that had done every kind of work the frontier demanded. He had lived through 9 Dakota winters, which meant he had outlasted men half his age. He had lost 34 sheep in one hard season. He had once pulled 2 school children home through a whiteout by following a fence line with his hands, while the wind tried to rip his coat from his body. When he spoke about winter, people listened. Halvor's girl, he said, ate standing in the doorway of the ice house. His eyes moved across the space, taking in the rotted sacks, the sawdust drifts, the open hatches over the vault. Knut told me you were looking for somewhere to stay. I found it, Marit said. Torsten laughed. It was not a cruel laugh like her brother's. It was the laugh of a man watching someone walk toward a cliff. This? This is where you found? The walls are thick, The door seals. There's no windows to let in drafts. There's no stove either, no chimney, no way to heat it that won't kill you with smoke. He stepped inside, moving carefully, testing the floor with each step. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking if it keeps cold in, it keeps cold out. But that's not how it works, girl. Heat moves, always, and without a source, without fuel. What, without a way to warm the air faster than these walls can steal it? He shook his head. Sleep one night in that ice house, and they'll carry you out stiff before dawn. I'm not asking your permission. No. Torsten's eyes met hers, and there was something in them that might have been respect, or might have been pity. You're not, but I'm giving you my judgment anyway, because your father was a decent man, and he wouldn't want me to stay quiet. He turned to go, then paused at the door. Pride is not insulation, merit fate. I've seen what the cold does to people who think they can outsmart it. Don't make me add you to that count. He left her standing in the dim light of the abandoned ice house, surrounded by rot and mouse droppings and the faint smell of sawdust, with his words hanging in the air like a verdict. That night, she slept on the floor of the upper room, not because she believed she could survive there, because she had nowhere else to go. She spread her mother's quilt over the bare planks and lay down with her lamp burning low beside her. The floor was hard. The air was still. From somewhere beneath the boards, she could hear the faint drip of water, an old drain that still carried moisture down toward the lake. She did not sleep well. The cold crept in slowly, settling into her joints, making her curl tighter and tighter beneath the quilt, until she was a small ball of preserved warmth surrounded by darkness. But she noticed something during the long hours before dawn. The walls did not sweat. The frost that feathered the outside of the building, visible through the crack around the door frame, did not appear on the inside. When she breathed, her breath fogged the air, but the fog did not settle on the boards the way it did in her father's cabin. This building held its breath differently than other buildings. She did not know enough to understand why, but she knew enough to wonder. The next morning, Marit began to plan. She could not heat the entire building. Torsten was right about that. The space was too large, too open, too designed for keeping things cold rather than keeping things warm. But she remembered something her father had said once about cabins and claim shanties and the difference between them. It's not about the walls, he had told her, patching the chinking around a window frame. It's about the air. You're not trying to warm the building. Oh, you're trying to warm a small pocket of air and keep it from escaping. Marit looked at the upper room with new eyes. It was too big for what she needed, but it contained spaces that were smaller. The corner by the interior partition, where two thick walls met. The area beneath the low ceiling, where heat would rise and stay. If she could create a room within the room, a sleeping berth just large enough for her body, sealed against drafts, insulated by the building's own design, then maybe she would not need to heat the whole structure. Maybe she would only need to heat herself. The idea was absurd. She knew it was absurd, but she also knew that every other option had already closed. She had $9. She had no stove. She had 6 weeks before the cold came. She was going to try. Marta Gerda came to the ice house 3 days later. She was a widow, 43 years old, with 4 surviving children and a face that had learned not to hope for anything too strongly. She had lost her husband to a fever the previous spring, and she had been managing alone since then with the help of her oldest son, who was 14 and already doing the work of a man. Marta was practical. That was how she had survived. She looked at problems the way a butcher looked at a carcass. What was usable, what was waste, what needed to be cut away before it spoiled everything else. She found Marit kneeling in the upper room, measuring the corner space with a length of twine. I heard what you were doing, Marte said. She did not sit down. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching Merritt work. The whole town is talking about it. They say you've gone mad with grief. I'm not mad. Marit kept measuring. 6 feet by 8 feet. That was what she needed. A berth just large enough to lie down in, just small enough to heat with a body and a lamp. That house was built to keep meat cold. Marte's voice was not unkind, but it was not warm either. Cold houses are not for living folk. The walls will sweat. The boards will rot. You'll breathe in damp until your lungs fill up with it. My father's cabin sweats too. Every cabin sweats in winter. And every cabin has a stove to dry the air out. Marte stepped inside, looking around at the thick walls, the low ceiling, the planks that had been designed to trap cold rather than release it. You have no stove, Marit. How will you keep the damp from killing you? Marit thought about the drain she had found, still working after 3 years of neglect. She thought about the vent slits near the roof line, sealed now but capable of being opened. She thought about the lessons her father had taught her about air and heat and moisture, never knowing that someday she would need them to survive. I'll figure it out, she said. Marte was silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head and turned to go. Pride, she said, the same word Torsten had used. Pride and youth, and no sense at all. I hope you're still alive to prove me wrong. Knut came on the 5th day. He did not come alone. He brought 2 men from town, one a clerk at the land office, the other a farmer who had known their father. They stood behind him like a jury while Knut walked through the abandoned building, touching the walls, examining the door frame, kicking at the rotted sacks still piled in the corner. This property has obligations on it, Knut said. His voice was calm, reasonable, the voice of a man who had already won and was merely explaining the terms of surrender. The ice company left debts when they failed. Someone is going to have to answer for those, and you've broken the lock, Marit. That's trespass. That's theft. Theft of what? Marit stood her ground, though her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Rotten wood? Mouse droppings? No one has touched this place in 3 years. That's not the point. Knut moved closer, lowering his voice so the men behind him could not hear. The point is that I can have you turned out of here any time I want. 1 complaint to the sheriff, and you're sleeping in the street. Is that what you want? What do you want? Knut smiled. It was the smile she remembered from childhood, from the days when he would take her toys and dare her to try to get them back. I want you to understand your position. You have nothing, Marit. No property, no claim, no husband, no prospects. When you freeze in this pile of timber, I won't be blamed for it, but I won't be there to scrape your body off the floor either. He turned and walked out, the 2 men following him like shadows. At the door, he paused. 3 weeks, he said. The first hard freeze will come in 3 weeks. I give you until then before you come crawling back to ask for a corner of my floor now, in your father's house. Then he was gone. Marit stood alone in the empty building, her hands shaking, her breath coming fast and shallow. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, the ridicule, the doubt, the cold certainty in everyone's eyes that she was going to die. But beneath the fear, something else was building, something that felt like the edge of a blade being sharpened. She was not going to crawl. The construction began the next morning. Marit started with the filth. She hauled out the rotten sacks by the armload, gagging at the smell of decay that rose from them. She swept the mouse droppings into piles and carried them out in her mother's old bread pan. She scrubbed the floor planks with lye water she had bought for 40 cents at the general store, burning through nearly a quarter of her money on soap and bristle brushes and a bucket that did not leak. The work was brutal. Her shoulders ached by noon. Her hands blistered and bled. The lye ate at her skin until her knuckles cracked and wept, and she had to wrap them in strips torn from an old shirt just to keep working. But the floor came clean. The walls emerged from behind years of grime and neglect. And when she knelt in the corner where she planned to build her berth, she could see the bones of the building clearly for the first time. The double-layered construction, the tight-fitted door, the ceiling low enough to trap rising heat. She tested the drain by pouring bucket after bucket of water onto the floor and watching where it went. The channel still worked. The water found its way to a gap in the foundation and trickled down toward the lake. That meant condensation would not pool. That meant the floor would not turn into a sheet of ice beneath her sleeping body. She examined the hatches over the ice vault and decided to seal one permanently and leave the other accessible for inspection. The vault itself was too large and too cold to use, but she needed to be able to check it to make sure no water was accumulating, no ice was forming where she did not want it. The berth she planned would be small, 6 feet by 8 feet, a space just large enough for a straw tick mattress, a wool blanket, and her mother's quilt. She would lower the ceiling with a cloth barrier, an old sheet or a quilted curtain, to trap whatever warmth her body and her lamp produced. She would seal every crack she could find with sawdust stuffed into flour sacks. She would make the space as tight as a coffin, because a coffin held air, and a coffin held stillness, and that was what she needed to survive. What progress came in measurements. Day 3. Frame for the berth walls marked with charcoal on the floor. Day 4. Lumber purchased for 60 cents, the cheapest salvage boards the yard had, warped and weathered but solid enough to hold. Day 5. First wall sections nailed together with hands so blistered she could barely grip the hammer. And then the first setback. The hinge on the outer door split. It happened on the 6th day, when Marit was testing the seal by running her lamp along the door frame to watch for draft flickers. The hinge had been old and rusted, and the cold was already making the metal brittle. When she pulled the door closed to check the fit, the upper hinge gave way with a sound like a bone snapping. The door sagged. Cold air poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. Were all the progress she had made on the berth, all the careful sealing of cracks and gaps, was worthless if the door itself would not close. She did not have money for a new hinge. She barely had money for food. Marit sat on the floor of the ice house with the broken door hanging open and the October wind cutting across her face, and she let herself feel the weight of it all for one long moment, the impossibility, the exhaustion, the absolute certainty in everyone's eyes that she was going to fail. Then she got up and walked to town. The blacksmith's name was Johansson, a thick-armed Dane who had set up shop in Watertown 2 years earlier. He looked at the broken hinge Marit carried and named a price for a replacement that made her stomach drop. $3, he said. Good iron. Won't rust. I have 60 cents. Johansson shrugged. Then you have 60 cents, not $3. Marit looked at the hinge in her hands. It was a simple mechanism, a loop of metal through a pin. The loop had cracked, but the pin was still sound. If she could find something to replace the loop. What about repairs? She asked. Can you weld this? Weld that? Johansson laughed. That metal is rotten through. It would break again in a week. Then what about a patch? Something to hold it together long enough to get through winter. Johansson studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed and held out his hand for the broken hinge. 60 cents, he said. I'll bend you a strap to reinforce it. No guarantees it holds, but it might. She paid him and waited while he worked, now watching the sparks fly from his hammer and thinking about all the other things that might break before winter was over. The repaired hinge held, for now. By the end of the second week, the berth was taking shape. Marit had framed out the sleeping space with salvage boards, creating walls that rose 4 feet from the floor and enclosed her corner of the room like a box with one open side. She had found an old carpet strip at the general store, sold to her for 15 cents because it was moth-eaten and stained, and she had nailed it across the threshold to block drafts at floor level. The ceiling came next. She had no lumber for it, so she improvised. An old sheet she had bought for a nickel, stretched across the top of the berth walls and weighted down with strips of wood. It sagged in the middle, but it created a pocket, a space where warm air could collect without rising to the full height of the room. For insulation, she made what she called snakes, flour sacks stuffed with dry sawdust and sewn shut. She pressed these into every crack she could find, along the berth walls, around the door frame, into the gaps where the floor met the foundation. The work was tedious and her fingers bled from the sewing, but each snake she placed made the space a little tighter, a little more sealed. The weather was changing. She could feel it in the morning air, in the way her breath fogged thicker each day, in the ice that began to form at the edges of the lake. The countdown was real now. Every day that passed was one day closer to the cold that would test everything she had built. And then Bernd Assen came. She did not know him at first. He was just an old man standing at the base of the slope, watching her nail a board into place with hands that shook from exhaustion. He was thin and weathered, his hair gone gray, his left hand missing 2 fingers that had been claimed by some old injury. "You're Halvor's daughter," he said when she finally noticed him. "I worked with him once. Helped him put up that back wall on your cabin." Marit wiped sweat from her forehead and looked at him more closely. "I remember. You were with the ice company." "Carpenter, repairman." He held up his damaged hand. "Until this happened. Planer took the fingers. After that, the company didn't need me much anymore." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was years ago." He looked past her, toward the ice house. "I heard what you were doing up there. Most people are laughing about it. I'm not." Marit waited. "That building was designed by a man who knew what he was doing," Bernd said. "Double walls, sawdust fill, drainage, ventilation. It was meant to hold 40-degree air in July. You think it can hold 40-degree air in January?" "I don't know," Marit said honestly, "but I think the principles are the same." "They are." Bernd started up the slope, moving carefully on the dry grass. "They are, and they aren't. Heat moves different than cold. If you're going to survive in there, you need to understand how." He reached the door and examined it. The repaired hinge, the salvage boards around the frame, the flour sack snakes stuffed into every visible gap. Then he turned back to Marit. "You're making mistakes," he said. "Small ones now, but they'll kill you when the temperature drops. What, you want me to show you what you're doing wrong?" Marit felt something shift in her chest. Not hope. She had learned not to trust hope, but something close to it. "Yes," she said. "Show me." Bernd taught like her father had taught, through work, not words. The first lesson came immediately. He pulled a thread from his coat and tied it to a nail head near the door frame, letting it dangle in the still air. Then he told Marit to close the door while he watched. The thread twitched, moved, pointed toward a gap she had not seen, where the frame met the wall at an angle that left a space barely wider than a knife blade. "That's where you're losing heat," Bernd said. "Cold comes in low, finds every crack. You can't see it, but you can track it. The thread doesn't lie." He showed her how to move the lamp along wall seams. watching for flickers in the flame that indicated drafts. He showed her how to dust the floor with flour and check in the morning for patterns that revealed air movement. He showed her how cold air pooled at ground level while warm air rose, and how a room that was sealed too tight would suffocate its occupant, while a room that was sealed too loose would freeze them. "The drain is good," he said, examining the channel she had cleared. "Moisture has to move out. If it pools, it freezes. If it freezes, it builds. If it builds, your floor becomes an ice sheet and your walls start to sweat." He tapped the planks with his boot. "This floor's dry. Keep it that way." "How?" "Never let wet boots inside your sleeping space. Never hang wet clothes where they'll drip. Never block the drain with anything that might freeze solid." He pointed to the vent slits near the roof line, currently sealed with rags. "Those need to open, just a crack. Enough to let moisture out without letting too much cold in." "But if I open them, won't I lose heat?" Barent shook his head. "You're not thinking about it right. You don't have a stove. You're not trying to pump heat into this space. You're trying to keep a small pocket of air from dropping below the temperature that kills you. That's different. That's about slowing the loss, not creating the gain. And if your air goes dead, if it stops moving, you'll suffocate before you freeze." He made her build an airlock. One hanging blanket inside the outer door, positioned so that when she entered, so she could close the outer door behind her before passing through the blanket into the main space. It was crude, just an old wool blanket hung from a rod, but it created a barrier. 2 doors instead of 1. A chamber where cold air could be trapped and prevented from reaching her sleeping space. "The berth is too big," he said, examining her work. 6 by 8 is too much air to warm with just your body and a lamp. Make it smaller. 5 by 7, 4 by 6 if you can stand it. Every inch you cut is an inch you don't have to heat." Marit looked at the space she had built, the space that already felt like a coffin. 4 by 6? I won't be able to move." "You don't need to move. You need to breathe. You need to sleep. You need to not die." Bernt met her eyes, and his expression was completely serious. "This isn't about comfort, girl. No, this is about survival. Every choice you make from now until spring is about one thing: keeping enough heat in your body to keep your heart beating. Everything else is luxury." The days blurred together after that. Marit tore down her berth walls and rebuilt them smaller. 4 by 6 feet now, barely enough room to lie down with her arms at her sides. She lowered the cloth ceiling until it nearly touched her face when she lay flat. She added a second layer of blankets to the threshold, creating a curtain that dropped almost to the floor but left a gap of 2 inches at the bottom for air circulation. Bernt came every day. Sometimes he brought tools, a hand auger, a folding ruler, a level he had kept from his carpentry days. Sometimes he brought knowledge, explaining how ice houses worked, how the double walls trapped air that acted as insulation, how the lack of windows prevented heat transfer through glass. He never talked about payment. He never talked about why he was helping. But Marit noticed things. The way he moved carefully, protecting his damaged hand. The way he sometimes stopped to catch his breath after climbing the slope. The way his clothes were patched and thin, and his face had the hollowed look of a man who did not always eat as much as he should. "You're not doing this for charity," she said one day as they worked together to reinforce the door frame. "No." He did not look up from his work. "I'm doing it because I'm bored, because no one in this town thinks I'm worth a damn anymore, or because your father was a good man and his daughter shouldn't freeze to death because her brother is a greedy pig." "Knut says you're a drunk." "Knut says a lot of things." Bernd set down his tool and straightened, pressing a hand to his lower back. "I was for a while, after the accident, after my wife died, after everything fell apart, but I stopped. Not because I wanted to, because I ran out of money." He smiled, and it was a sad smile, the smile of a man who had made his peace with his own failings. Now I just sit in my room and wait for something to matter. Your project matters. Marit did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and they went back to work. The first frost came on the 20th of October. Marit woke before dawn to find ice crystals feathering the outer door, its delicate patterns that caught the first light like spider webs made of glass. She pushed through the airlock and stepped outside into air that bit at her cheeks, her nose, her ears. 26 degrees, according to the thermometer that Bernd had borrowed from a neighbor, the first real cold of the season. She went back inside and checked the berth. The outer walls of the building were rimmed with frost. The air in the main room was cold enough that her breath fogged thick and white. But when she crawled through the blanket curtain into her sleeping space, she felt the difference. Not warm, nothing was warm, but less cold. The air was still, trapped by the layers of fabric and sawdust and salvage boards. Her body had been heating it all night, and the heat had not escaped. When she put her hand on the interior wall, she felt the same thing she had felt on that first day. Not warmth, but the absence of the sharp, biting cold that seeped through every other wall she had ever known. It was working. She crawled out into the main room and sat on the cold floor, her mother's quilt wrapped around her shoulders, and let herself feel something she had not felt since her father died. Hope. The hope lasted exactly 3 days. On the 23rd of October, boys from town came to the ice house. There were 4 of them, ranging from 12 to 15, and they had come with pockets full of lake ice chunks and heads full of cruel jokes. Marit was inside when she heard them, laughing, shouting, throwing things against the outer door. The impacts sounded like punches, like fists striking wood. She wrapped herself in her quilt and waited, or as hoping they would get bored and leave. They did not get bored. "Ice Queen," one of them shouted. "How's your ice palace? Come out and play. We'll keep you warm." "Maybe she's already frozen. Maybe we should check." The loading door shook as they threw themselves against it. The repaired hinge groaned. Marit thought of everything she had built, everything she had worked for, and she thought of what would happen if that door came down. She found the hammer Bernd had left behind and went to the door. The boys were not expecting her to come out. They were standing in a cluster at the base of the slope, gathering more ice chunks, when she appeared in the doorway with the hammer in her hand and murder in her eyes. "Get out," she said. Her voice was calm. She was surprised by how calm it sounded. "Get out and don't come back." The oldest boy, 15, with a face that would be handsome someday and was merely cruel now, laughed. "Or what? You'll hammer us?" "I'll hammer the first one who touches that door again." Marit raised the hammer, feeling its weight, feeling the anger that had been building in her chest for weeks. "And then I'll walk to town and tell your mothers what you've been doing, all of you. Would they be proud?" The boy's smile flickered. She saw doubt in his eyes, the doubt of someone who had expected easy prey and found something else instead. "She's crazy," one of the younger boys said. "Let's go." They went. Marit stood in the doorway until they disappeared over the rise, and then she sat down on the cold ground and shook for a very long time. That night, the rod holding her airlock blanket pulled loose from the wall. The blanket fell. Cold air rushed into the main room, then into the berth itself. By the time Marit woke up, the temperature inside her sleeping space had dropped 10 degrees, and frost was forming on the ceiling cloth. She fixed it. She found new nails, drove them deeper into the wood, reinforced the rod with a strip of salvage board. But the setback cost her hours of sleep and left her fingers so cold she could barely feel them by morning. The next day, Knut came again. He did not bring witnesses this time. He came alone, walking up the slope with his hands in his pockets and a smile on his face that made her skin crawl. 3 weeks, he said. I told you 3 weeks. And? And it's been 3 weeks. He looked around at the building, at the improvements she had made, at the life she was trying to scrape together inside walls that everyone said would kill her. You're still here. I'll admit I'm surprised. Surprised enough to leave me alone? Knut laughed. No, not that surprised. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Here's what's going to happen, little sister. The first real storm of winter is going to come. It's going to blow through this valley like the wrath of God. And when it does, your door's going to buckle, your walls are going to sweat, and you're going to come crawling to my cabin begging for a corner of floor space. He smiled wider. And I'm going to make you beg. I'm going to make you beg in front of everyone who told me I should have let you stay. Why? The word came out before she could stop it. Why do you hate me this much? Something flickered in Knut's eyes. Not guilt. She did not think he was capable of guilt, but something close to it. Something that looked almost like fear. Because you remind me of her, he said. Mother, the way you look at me, the way you think you're better than me, even when you have nothing. He turned away. I'm not going to let you win, Marit. Not this time. Not ever. He walked down the slope and did not look back. Marit stood at the door of the ice house until Knut disappeared from sight. Then she turned and looked at the building she had chosen over everything else. The walls were thick. The door was sealed. The berth was small and tight and warming. But outside, the sky was turning the color of iron, and the wind was picking up from the northwest, nor carrying the first breath of something that would be worse than anything she had faced so far. Winter was coming, and whether she lived or died, she was going to face it alone. The first week of November brought weather that could not decide what it wanted to be. Some mornings, the temperature dropped to 15 degrees, and the lake ice thickened enough that men began talking about when they could start cutting. Other mornings, the air warmed to 40, and the ice retreated from the shore, leaving bands of dark water that looked like open wounds. Marit learned to read the sky the way she had learned to read her father's moods, watching for the signs of what was coming, trying to prepare for shifts she could not control. Bernd came every day now. Sometimes he stayed for an hour. Sometimes he stayed until dark, working alongside her on improvements she had not known she needed. The floor is your enemy, he told her one afternoon, kneeling beside the berth with his damaged hand pressed against the planks. Heat rises, cold sinks. If you lie directly on these boards, the cold will pull the warmth right out of your body. You need a barrier. I have the quilt. The quilt goes on top of you. I'm talking about underneath. He stood, wincing as his knees protested. You need a platform, something to lift you off the floor. Even 6 inches makes a difference. They built it together over the next 2 days. Crate boards salvaged from behind the general store, nailed together into a frame that raised the sleeping surface half a foot above the planks. Bernd showed her how to stuff the space beneath with dry straw, as creating an additional layer of insulation. The straw smelled like summer, like fields and warmth, and Marit found herself breathing it in during the long, cold nights. Where did you learn all this? She asked him once, as they worked to seal a gap she had missed in the corner seam. The ice house, he said. 3 years I worked here, maintaining the building, fixing what broke. You spend enough time inside a structure, you start to understand how it thinks. He paused, pressing a sawdust snake into the crack with practiced fingers. My wife used to say I loved buildings more than people. She wasn't wrong. What happened to her? Fever, same one that took half the children in Watertown that year. His voice did not change, but his hands stopped moving for a moment. After that, I didn't see much point in anything. The ice company let me go. I started drinking. I stopped eating. He resumed working, pushing the snake deeper into the gap. I would have died if I'd had the energy to finish the job. But you didn't. No. He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that she had not seen before, something that might have been gratitude. I didn't, and now I'm here, helping a 19-year-old girl insulate herself into a building that everyone says will kill her. Life is strange. Mara did not know what to say, so she said the only thing that felt true. Thank you. Bernd nodded and went back to work. The second week of November brought the first real snow. It came overnight, 6 inches of white powder that transformed the lakeshore into something from a fairy tale. Marit woke to silence, the deep, muffled silence that only snow could create, and stepped outside to find a world she barely recognized. The ice house looked different under snow, smaller somehow, and more solid. The banked earth around its foundation had disappeared beneath white drifts, and the loading door was rimmed with frost that sparkled in the morning light. She spent the day clearing paths. From the door to the privy she had dug behind the building. From the door to the woodpile that Bernd had helped her stack against the east wall, 2 cords of oak and ash that had cost her $3 and would need to last until spring. From the door to the lake, where she could chop through the ice for water. The work warmed her. By midday, she had stripped off her coat and was working in just her dress and apron, her breath fogging in the air, but her body generating enough heat to fight the cold. This was something she understood. Physical labor, measurable progress, problems that could be solved with a shovel and time. It was the other problems that kept her awake at night. Torsten Kvama returned on the 15th of November. He came alone this time, walking up the snow-covered slope with a staff in his hand and his coat buttoned to his chin. Marit saw him coming and felt her stomach tighten. The last time they had spoken, he had predicted her death. She wondered if he had come to check whether his prediction had come true. "Still alive?" he said when he reached the door. It was not a question. Still alive. He looked at the building, at the cleared paths, at the woodpile stacked against the wall. His eyes moved slowly, taking in details, assessing. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than before, curious instead of certain. "Bernd Assen has been helping you." "He has." "He was a good carpenter before the accident, before the drinking." Torsten shifted his weight, leaning on his staff. "May I see inside?" Marit hesitated. Then she stepped aside and let him enter. He moved through the ice house the way Bernd had moved on that first day, slowly, carefully, examining everything. He touched the airlock blanket and watched it sway. He knelt beside the berth and pressed his palm against the raised platform. He looked at the sawdust snakes stuffed into every crack, the cloth ceiling stretched tight above the sleeping space, the small vent slit near the roof line that Marit kept cracked open day and night. "The floor's dry," he said finally. The drain still works. The walls are not sweating. The air moves, slowly, but it moves." Torsten stood and faced her. His expression was unreadable. "This is not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Failure." He said the word without embarrassment. "I expected to find you sick, or desperate, or already gone. I expected the building to be damp and rotting and filled with the smell of someone who had made a terrible mistake. And instead? Instead, I find something that might work." He shook his head slowly, and for the first time, Marit saw something in his face that looked almost like respect. "I'm not saying it will. The cold hasn't truly come yet. When it does, when it drops to 20 below, 30 below, we'll see what this building can really do." He moved toward the door, then paused. "See, but I was wrong to say they'd carry you out stiff before dawn. Not because the danger isn't real, because you're fighting harder than I thought you would." He left without waiting for a response. Marit stood in the doorway and watched him descend the slope, his staff punching holes in the snow with each step. She did not know if what he had said was praise or warning. She suspected it was both. The temperature dropped on the 20th of November. It happened overnight, the way the worst things always happened. Marit went to sleep in air that was cold but manageable, and woke to air that felt like it wanted to kill her. She could not read the thermometer in the dark, but she did not need to. She could feel it in the way her breath crystallized the moment it left her lips. She could feel it in the ache of her joints, plus the stiffness of her fingers, the way the quilt seemed to trap nothing at all. She lit her lamp and crawled out of the berth. The main room was brutal, cold enough that she could see frost forming on the inside of the outer door. The airlock blanket was stiff and crackling. The floor, which had stayed dry all through October and early November, was developing a thin skin of ice in the corners where the cold seeped through. She checked the thermometer by lamplight. 8 degrees. Not the worst it would get, not even close, but bad enough to test what she had built. She crawled back into the berth and pulled the curtain tight behind her. She added her coat to the pile of blankets. She curled into a ball and pulled her knees to her chest and let her body do the only thing it could do, generate heat and pray that the walls held it in. By morning, the ice on the floor had thickened, but the berth itself was warmer than the room around it. The thermometer on her platform read 31 degrees, cold but survivable, cold but not death. She had passed the first test. The tests kept coming. Late November brought a wind that howled across the lake for 3 days straight, driving snow against the loading door and finding every gap that Marit had failed to seal. She spent those days stuffing new cracks, adjusting the vent, adding layer after layer to the airlock blanket, until it hung so thick and heavy that pushing through it was like swimming through wool. December brought the shortest days she had ever known. The sun rose late and set early, and the hours between felt like twilight, even at noon. She burned through lamp oil faster than she had expected. Berzin had to make the walk to town in temperatures that froze the moisture in her nose and left her fingers numb, even inside 2 pairs of mittens. She was running out of money. The $9 she had started with was down to $3.40. She had spent the rest on lumber, nails, lamp oil, food, and the dozens of small necessities that survival demanded. At this rate, she would be broke by January. And then what? The building would not feed her. The building would not light her lamp. The building was only one piece of the puzzle, and the other pieces were running out. Bernd found her counting coins one afternoon, her hands shaking not from cold but from fear. "How much?" he asked. She told him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I know a man who needs help with his books, accounts, ledgers, no, that sort of thing. His wife used to do it, but she died last spring, and he's been making a mess of things ever since." "I don't know accounting." "You know numbers. You know how to add and subtract and keep track of what goes where." Bernd sat down across from her, his damaged hand resting on his knee. "It wouldn't be much, a few hours a week, but it would be something." Marit thought about pride. She thought about crawling back to Knut. She thought about all the things she had sworn she would not do. "Who is this man?" "Eric Lindgren." The name hit her like a slap. Lindgren, the farmer who had told her he had no room, the man who had been her father's friend, or something close to it. "He turned me away," she said. "He did." Bernd's voice was calm, and he's regretted it ever since. He knows what Knut did. He knows you've been up here fighting to survive while everyone else watched. He wants to make it right. By paying me to do his books. By giving you work. There's a difference. Bernd met her eyes. This isn't charity, Marit. You'd be doing real work for real pay. And Lindgren is a fair man. He'll pay you what the work is worth. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she walked to the Lindgren farm and took the job. December passed in a rhythm of work and cold and small victories. Marit went to the Lindgren farm twice a week, spending hours bent over ledgers that were indeed a mess, straightening out accounts that had been neglected since the wife's death. Eric Lindgren paid her 75 cents a week, not much, but enough to buy lamp oil, enough to buy food, nor enough to keep the impossible math of survival balanced for a little while longer. The work had an unexpected benefit. It got her out of the ice house. It gave her something to think about besides cold and hunger and the constant fear that she was going to die. It connected her to a world beyond the frozen lakeshore, a world of normal people doing normal things, a world where survival was not a daily battle but simply a fact of life. Bernd kept coming. The lessons continued, though they felt less like lessons now and more like conversations between equals. He showed her how to bank snow against the outer wall for extra insulation, but only on the windward side where it would not trap meltwater. He showed her how to position the lamp so that its heat rose directly toward the cloth ceiling, concentrating warmth where she needed it most. See, he showed her how to make a simple heat trap from a tin can and a piece of cloth, capturing the lamp's warmth and directing it toward her sleeping platform. "You're getting better at this," he said one afternoon, watching her seal a crack with the easy confidence of someone who had done it 100 times before. "Better than most. Most people aren't stupid enough to try." "Stupid isn't the word I'd use." He settled onto the crate that served as his seat, moving carefully the way he always did now. His breathing had gotten worse in the cold months, a rasp that came and went, but never fully disappeared. Determined, stubborn, maybe a little crazy, but not stupid. What's the difference? Stupid is doing something without thinking it through. You've thought this through. Every piece of it, every seam, every layer. You thought every choice. He coughed, a wet sound that he tried to hide behind his hand. Your father would be proud. The words hit her harder than she expected. She turned away so he would not see her face. He would have done it better, she said. Maybe, but he's not here. You are. Marte Gerda came to the ice house on the 28th of December. She came with her youngest daughter, Eli, a girl of 7 who looked at the building with wide, curious eyes. Marte carried 2 carpet strips over her arm, the same kind Marit had bought at the general store, but thicker and in better condition. I found these in my barn, Marte said, not meeting Marit's eyes. They were just taking up space. I thought maybe you could use them. Marit looked at the carpet strips. Then she looked at Marte's face, at the uncomfortable expression of someone doing something that did not come naturally. Thank you, she said. Marte nodded stiffly. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, The room. Can I see it? Marit led her inside. Marta moved through the ice house the way Torsten had moved, slowly, examining everything. But where Torsten had been assessing, Marta was learning. She touched the airlock blanket and felt its weight. She knelt beside the berth and studied the raised platform, the cloth ceiling, the sawdust snakes stuffed into every crack. It's warmer than I expected, she said finally. It gets cold at night, but not as cold as outside. How cold? Marit showed her the thermometer readings she had been tracking. The outside temperature, the main room temperature, the birth temperature, the difference between them. Marte studied the numbers for a long time. "You're losing less heat than my cabin," she said, "and you don't even have a stove. The walls do most of the work. I just had to figure out how to use them." Marte looked at her daughter, then back at Marit. Something shifted in her expression, not warmth exactly, but the beginning of respect. "I told you cold houses were not for living folk," she said. "I may have been wrong." It was not an apology, but from Marta Gierda, it was close. January of 1888 began with weather that felt like a joke. The temperature climbed into the 30s. The snow softened and melted. Water ran in streams down the slope toward the lake, and the ice at the shore's edge grew dark and thin. People came out of their cabins blinking in the unexpected warmth, talking about early springs and mild winters and the strange mercy of a Dakota January. Marit did not trust it. Bernd did not trust it either. "Weather like this is a trap," he said on the 4th of January, standing at the door of the ice house and watching the water drip from the eaves. "The cold doesn't leave. It just hides. And when it comes back angry." He was coughing more now. The rasp in his chest had become a rattle, and sometimes he had to stop in the middle of a sentence to catch his breath. Marit had noticed but said nothing. There was nothing to say. They both knew what was happening. "I want to show you something," Barrett said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather notebook, worn soft by years of handling. "I kept this when I worked here. Notes on the building, how it was designed. What worked and what didn't." He handed it to her. Marit opened the notebook and saw pages filled with careful handwriting, diagrams of wall construction, notes on sawdust density, calculations about heat loss and air circulation. It was everything Bernd had learned in 3 years of maintaining the ice house, written down in the precise hand of a man who understood that knowledge was worth preserving. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because I won't be here forever." He said it simply, without drama. "The chest is getting worse. I can feel it. This winter or next, I'll be gone." He met her eyes. "But this building will still be standing, and someone needs to understand how it works." "Bernd." "Don't." He held up his damaged hand. "Don't argue. Don't comfort. Just take the book and learn what's in it. That's all I'm asking." Marit closed the notebook and held it against her chest. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when you survive the winter." The weather turned on the morning of January 12th. Marit woke to a sky that had gone wrong. The warm air of the past week was still there, but beneath it she could feel something else, a pressure, a tension, the held-breath stillness that came before something terrible. She went to the Lindgren farm as usual, spending the morning hunched over ledgers, while outside the window the clouds thickened and lowered. By noon the temperature was still above freezing, but the wind had shifted, swinging around to the northwest and picking up speed. Eric Lindgren noticed it too. "Storm comin'," he said, looking out the window at the sky. "Might want to head back early." Marit packed up her work and started home. She was halfway to the ice house when the world ended. It hit like a wall. One moment the air was still, almost warm. The next moment the wind came screaming across the prairie with a force that nearly knocked her off her feet. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in what felt like seconds. Snow that had been sitting in gentle drifts suddenly became airborne, filling the air with white that was not falling but flying, driven horizontal by a wind that sounded like 100 trains. Marit could not see. She could not breathe. She could not tell which direction she was facing or where the ground was or whether she was moving forward or backward or in circles. She remembered what Torsten had said about pulling children home by following a fence line. She remembered what Bernd had said about storms that came fast and killed faster. She remembered everything she had learned in 4 months of surviving, and she used every piece of it. She dropped to her knees. The wind was slightly less brutal down low, and she could feel the frozen grass beneath her mittens. She knew this grass. She knew which direction it bent, which direction the lake was, which direction home was. She began to crawl. It took her an hour to cover a quarter-mile. By the time she reached the ice house, her face was numb, her hands were claws, and she was sobbing without tears because the cold had frozen the moisture before it could leave her eyes. She found the door by touch, pulled it open, fought through the airlock blanket, and collapsed on the floor of the main room. She was alive, but outside, the storm was just beginning. The first hour was all mechanics. Marit stripped off her wet outer clothes and forced herself into the berth, pulling every blanket and quilt she owned on top of her body. The lamp was already burning. She had left it going that morning, a habit Bernd had taught her, and its small heat was the only warmth in the world. She lay there shaking, listening to the wind howl against the loading door, feeling the building shudder with each gust. The door held. The airlock blanket held. The walls that had been built to keep July out were keeping January out, and for the first time since she had broken into this building, she understood that she had made the right choice. Then she heard the pounding. It came from the outer door, a fist striking wood, barely audible over the storm. Then again. Then a voice, ragged and desperate, calling her name. Merritt crawled out of the berth and pushed through the airlock blanket. The main room had dropped 10 degrees in the time she had been warming up, but she barely felt it. She grabbed the bar and lifted it and pulled the door open. The wind hit her like a blow. Snow poured into the room, swirling white chaos that made it impossible to see. But she could feel hands grabbing at her, pulling, and she grabbed back and hauled until 2 bodies tumbled through the door, and she could slam it shut behind them. It was Bernd, and in his arms, wrapped in a horse blanket so covered with snow that it looked like a cocoon, was Eli Gerdy. The girl was barely conscious. Bernd had found her on the road between the Gerda farm and town. She had been walking to the schoolhouse when the storm hit, and she had gotten turned around in the whiteout. By the time Bernd stumbled across her, she was sitting in a snowdrift, not moving, not crying, just staring at nothing with eyes that had already started to glaze. "Had to carry her," Bernd gasped, his voice barely audible over his coughing. "Couldn't leave her. Couldn't get her home. Your place was closer." Marit did not waste time on words. She grabbed the horse blanket and pulled it away from Eli's body, seeing the girl's blue lips, her pale skin, the frost that had formed in her eyebrows. She carried her through the airlock blanket and into the berth, stripping away the wet clothes, wrapping her in the driest blankets, tucking her against the platform where the lamp's heat rose. The berth was too small for 3 people. It was barely large enough for 1, but Marit made it work. Positioning Eli closest to the lamp, then crawling in beside her, then pulling Bernd in last so that the girl was sandwiched between 2 adult bodies that could give her warmth. "The door," Bernd wheezed. "We left it open too long. The air—" He was right. The main room had dropped to freezing. Frost was forming on the inside of the walls. The careful temperature differential that Marit had spent 4 months building was collapsing, the cold pouring in through every gap the storm could find. She crawled out of the berth and went to work. The second hour was all survival. Marit sealed the gap around the outer door with every spare piece of cloth she could find, rags, an old shirt, strips torn from a blanket that was already falling apart. She checked the vent slit and found it clogged with wind-driven snow, ear, so she cleared it with her fingers, letting the moisture escape even as the cold poured in. She pushed sawdust snakes into cracks that had opened up, seams that had been tight yesterday, and were now admitting wisps of frozen air. Behind her, in the berth, she could hear Eli's breathing, ragged at first, then slowly steadying as the girl's body warmed. She could hear Burnett's coughing, wet and terrible, getting worse with each minute he spent in the cold. The building was fighting. The insulation was doing its job, slowing the heat loss, buying time. But time was not infinite. If the storm lasted all night, if the temperature dropped another 20 degrees, if the door gave way or the vent clogged completely, she did not let herself finish the thought. She kept working. The third pounding came at dusk. It was weaker than the first, barely audible over the howling wind. Marit almost missed it, but then it came again, and she heard a voice, high and desperate, a woman's voice calling words she could not understand. She went to the door. Bernt's voice came from the berth. "Don't! You open that door again. We lose everything we've built up. Someone's out there. Someone's always out there. You can't save everyone." Marit thought about Eli, wrapped in blankets in the berth, her lips no longer blue. She thought about Bernt, who had walked through the storm to bring the girl to safety. She thought about her father, who had spent his life helping neighbors even when it cost him. She thought about the kind of person she wanted to be. She opened the door. It was Randy. Newt's wife stood in the screaming white void, her shawl wrapped around something small and still, her face a mask of ice and terror. Behind her, barely visible through the snow, was Knut himself, stumbling forward with hands that had already gone white at the fingertips. "The cabin," Randy gasped. "The stove, the chimney. The smoke came back. We couldn't breathe." Marit did not wait for her to finish. She grabbed Randy's arm and pulled her inside, then reached out into the storm and seized Knut's coat and hauled him through the door as well. The wind fought her, tried to rip them all back out into the white death, but she held on until the door was closed and the bar was in place, and they were inside the ice house, inside the building everyone had said would kill her, inside the last shelter left. The berth was never designed for 5 people. It was 4 by 6 feet. Barely enough room to lie down. Now it had to hold 2 adults, 2 children, and 1 injured old man, all of them crammed together in a space that felt like a coffin and smelled like wet wool and fear. Marit made it work. She put Eli and little Arn in the center, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. She put Randy beside them, wrapping the woman's frozen hands in dry cloth, making her flex her fingers over and over to keep the blood moving. She pushed Knut into the corner farthest from the lamp, where the cold was worst, and did not feel guilty about it. Bernt she kept beside herself, closest to the vent slit, where the air was freshest. His coughing had gotten worse, but his eyes were clear, and when she looked at him, she saw understanding. "Too many bodies," he whispered. "Too much moisture. Lois, the air will go bad." "I know. You need to vent more, but if you vent more, you lose heat." "I know." She did not know how to solve both problems. She only knew that she had to try. The crisis came near midnight. The temperature outside had dropped to 25 below zero, colder than anything Marit had ever experienced. Colder than anything the building had been tested against. Inside the berth, the thermometer read 38 degrees, survivable, but barely, and the air had gone thick and heavy, saturated with moisture from 5 breathing bodies in a space meant for 1. The lamp flame was guttering, not from lack of oil, she had plenty of oil, but from lack of oxygen. The fire was eating what little good air remained, and soon there would not be enough left for the people. Marit thought about what Bernt had taught her. Heat can be won back, Stale air cannot. She made a choice. She cracked the vent slit wider, a full inch instead of a crack. Cold air poured in, dropping the temperature inside the berth by 5 degrees in as many minutes. Arno whimpered. Randy moaned. Knut said something that might have been a curse, but the lamp flame steadied, and the air began to move. Blankets, Marit said. Everyone under every blanket we have. Don't move. Don't talk. Just breathe slow and let the building do the work. They obeyed. There was nothing else to do. The hours passed. The storm raged. The building held. Near dawn, Marit felt Bernd's hand close around hers. The thermometer, he whispered. His voice was barely audible, but his eyes were bright. Check it. She did not want to move. Every inch of her body was pressed against someone else, and the warmth they had created together was the only thing keeping them alive. But she reached out, her arm extending into the cold air beyond the blankets, and found the thermometer on the platform ledge. She held it close to the lamp. Inside the berth, surrounded by bodies and blankets, 53 degrees. In the main room beyond the curtain, 22 degrees. Outside, where the storm still howled, 30 below zero. The walls built to keep July out had kept death out instead. The building designed for cold had become a machine for preserving warmth. Not much warmth, not comfortable warmth, but enough. Enough to keep 5 hearts beating until morning. The storm broke at dawn. The wind died first, dropping from a howl to a moan, to silence so sudden it felt like a new kind of danger. Then the snow stopped falling, and the sky lightened from black to gray to the pale washed-out blue of a winter morning after a battle. Marit crawled out of the berth and pushed through the airlock blanket and opened the outer door. The world had changed. Snow lay in drift 6 feet deep against the loading door, carved into shapes by the wind. The lake was invisible under white. The sky was empty, scoured clean, as if the storm had taken everything that was not nailed down and carried it away to somewhere else. She stood in the doorway and breathed air that felt like knives in her lungs, and she realized that she was alive. They were all alive. The aftermath unfolded slowly. Randy emerged first, carrying Arne, her face slack with exhaustion but her eyes clear. Eli came next, holding Marit's hand, walking on legs that were shaky but whole. Yet Bernd had to be helped. His coughing had turned into something worse, a deep, wet rattle that made Marit fear what the next few days would bring. Knut came last. He stood in the doorway of the ice house, looking at the building he had mocked, at the sister he had thrown out, at the shelter that had saved his wife and son when his own cabin had failed. His face was unreadable. The cabin, he said finally. I need to check the cabin. Go, Marit said. We'll be here. He left without thanking her, but he left without mocking her too, and that, she supposed, was something. The news came back to the ice house in fragments over the following days. A hired hand from the Svensson place had been found frozen against his wagon box less than 100 yards from shelter. Or 2 schoolchildren from a farm north of town had walked into a drift and never come out. The Tveit cabin, Knut's cabin now, the cabin that had been her home, had survived the storm, but only barely. The stove had backdrafted, filling the rooms with smoke. The chinking had split in a dozen places. The door had frozen shut, and Knut had had to break through a window to get his family out. If they had stayed, they would have died. The smoke would have killed them, or the cold that poured through the broken chinking, or the fire that might have started when the stove finally gave way. They had lived because Marit had let them in. They had lived because the building everyone said would kill her had kept them warm instead. Torsten Kvamme came on the 3rd day after the storm. He did not knock. He simply appeared at the door. his staff in his hand, his face set in an expression that Marit could not read. He looked at the building. He looked at the cleared path. He looked at the smoke rising from the chimney of the small fire pit that Berend had helped her build outside for cooking and heating water. Then he looked at her. "I said they'd carry you out stiff before dawn," he said. His voice was quiet. "I remember. I was wrong." He shook his head slowly. "I've been wrong about a lot of things in my life, but I've never been this wrong. That room," he gestured at the ice house behind her, "that room carried the storm instead. I don't know how. I don't know why. But I saw the Tveit cabin. I saw what the storm did to every other building on this shore, and I saw 5 people walk out of your door alive." He met her eyes. "I won't doubt you again, Marit Tveit. I don't think anyone will." He turned and walked away, his staff punching holes in the snow. Marit watched him go, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not triumph. The cost had been too high for triumph. But recognition. The knowledge that she had done something that mattered, something that would be remembered, something that had changed the way people saw her and the way they saw what was possible. She had survived the winter. Now she had to figure out what came next. The days after the storm were measured in small recoveries. Eli Gerda went home to her mother on the second morning, walking between Marit and Randi with her hands wrapped in wool mittens and her face still pale from the cold that had nearly killed her. Marte met them at the door of her cabin, and when she saw her daughter alive, she made a sound that Marit had never heard before, something between a sob and a laugh, torn from somewhere deep. She did not thank Marit then. She was too busy holding her daughter, pressing her face into the girl's hair, rocking back and forth in the doorway, while the January wind cut across the yard. But her eyes met Marit's over Eli's head, and in them was something that had not been there before. The validation began the same afternoon. People came to the ice house like pilgrims to a shrine. They came alone and in pairs, trudging up the snow-covered slope to stand at the door and ask to see inside. They were farmers and shopkeepers, widows and hired hands, people who had heard what had happened during the storm and needed to see it for themselves. Marit let them in, every one of them. She showed them the berth, the small, a coffin-like space where 5 people had survived the worst night of the winter. She showed them the airlock blanket, the sawdust snakes, the cloth ceiling that trapped rising heat. She showed them Bernd's thermometer readings, the numbers that proved what the building had done. And she answered their questions. "How did you keep the air from going bad?" "You vent high, never low. The stale air rises. You let it escape, and fresh air comes in underneath." "But doesn't that let the cold in?" "Some, but you can recover from cold. You can't recover from suffocation." "How did you heat it without a stove?" "Body heat, lamp heat, and the walls." Marit pressed her palm against the interior partition. "Feel that. It's not warm, but it's not frozen either. The walls slow everything down. They give your body time to catch up." The visitors touched the walls the way she had touched them on that first day. They felt the difference, the absence of the biting cold that seeped through every other building they had ever known. And one by one she saw understanding dawn in their eyes. This was not magic. This was not luck. This was a method that could be learned. Marte Gerda came on the 5th day after the storm. She came alone, without Eli, her face set in the expression of someone about to do something difficult. She stood at the door of the ice house and did not move until Marit invited her inside. "I want to understand," she said, "not just see it. Understand it, so I can do it myself." Marit showed her everything. She explained the double walls and the sawdust fill, the way trapped air acted as insulation. She explained the drain that kept the floor dry and the vent that kept the air fresh. She explained the berth within the room, the principle of heating a small space instead of a large one, the way layers work to slow heat loss. Marte listened without interrupting. When Marit finished, she was quiet for a long moment. My husband used to say I was practical, she said finally. He said I never let my heart get ahead of my head. She looked at Marit, and her eyes were wet. I told you cold houses were not for living folk. I told you the walls would sweat and the boards would rot. I was wrong. You were being practical. I was being afraid. Marte shook her head. Afraid of something I didn't understand. Afraid that if I looked too closely, I'd have to admit that a 19-year-old girl knew something I didn't. She straightened, most squaring her shoulders the way she did when she was about to make a decision. I want to learn. I want to make my cabin better. Will you teach me? Marit thought about all the times Marty had doubted her, all the times she had dismissed the idea, called it foolish, predicted failure. Yes, she said, I'll teach you. The teaching began that same week. Marit went to Marte's cabin with Berndt's notebook in her hand and showed her how to test for drafts using thread and lamp flame. They found 6 places where cold air was seeping in, gaps around the door frame, cracks in the chinking, a poorly fitted window that let wind whistle through. Start with the worst one, Marit said. Seal it completely, then move to the next. Every gap you close is heat you keep. Marte worked beside her, mixing clay and lime for putty, just stuffing sawdust into cracks, hanging a second blanket inside the door to create a crude airlock. The work was slow, and her hands were clumsy at first, but she learned. And when they finished, the cabin was warmer than it had been since the day it was built. My water bucket didn't freeze last night, Marte said the next morning, wonder in her voice. It's never not frozen in January. Word spread. Within 2 weeks, half the farms around Lake Campesca had someone asking for help with their doors, their walls, their sleeping arrangements. Marit could not visit them all, but she taught the ones she could, and they taught others. The method spread like ripples in water, not perfectly, not uniformly, but steadily, person by person, cabin by cabin. Eric Lindgren added a vestibule to his front door and reported that his fuel consumption had dropped by 1/4. A widow named Sigrid Vangen built a sleeping alcove in the corner of her one-room shack and said she no longer woke with frost on her blankets. A farmer whose name Marit never learned created a sawdust-packed milk room that kept his butter from freezing solid. None of them did it exactly the way Marit had done it. They adapted, improvised, made mistakes, and corrected them. But the core principles held: small spaces, sealed gaps, controlled ventilation, dry floors. The lessons she had learned in the ice house were becoming common knowledge. And every time someone thanked her, every time someone said her name with respect instead of pity, she felt the weight of those early months lift a little more. As Bernd watched the transformation from the chair Marit had built for him, he was too weak now to climb the slope most days. The cough that had started in December had settled into his lungs like a permanent resident, and some mornings he could barely speak for the rattling in his chest. Marit had moved him into the ice house 2 days after the storm, setting up a cot in the main room where the air was warmer than his rented room in town, and the walls did not let in drafts. He did not complain. He never complained. But she could see the effort it took him to breathe, and she knew what it meant. You're doing it right, he told her one afternoon, as she returned from teaching Marte how to bank a fire for overnight warmth. Giving it away instead of hoarding it. Well, that's how knowledge survives. I learned it from you. You learned the technique from me, the generosity you already had. He shifted on the cot, trying to find a position that let him breathe easier. Your father was the same way. always helping people even when it cost him. I used to think it was foolish. Now I think maybe he understood something I didn't. Marit sat down beside the cot. What did he understand? That we're all connected, that my warmth is your warmth if we share it right. Berndt's eyes found hers. That building, this building, it works because everything is part of a system. The walls and the air and the drain and the vent all working together. Take away one piece and the whole thing fails. He coughed, a wet, terrible sound. People are like that too. We just forget. They disagreed for the first time in February. The disagreement was small, almost trivial, about the best position for a vent slit in the schoolhouse storm room that Marit was helping to design. Bernd wanted it higher, near the peak of the roof, where rising warm air would push moisture out. Marit wanted it lower, where it would be easier to clear if it clogged with snow. Higher is better, Bernd insisted, his voice strained from the effort of arguing. The whole point is to let warm air escape at the top. If you put it lower, you're venting cold air and keeping the moisture inside. But if it clogs, people will die trying to reach it. Children can't climb to the roof peak in a storm. Then they clear it before the storm. That's preparation, not design. Preparation fails. People forget. People get caught off guard. Marit crossed her arms. I was caught off guard on the 12th. If I'd had to climb to a roof peak to clear a vent, I'd be dead. The silence stretched between them. Berndt's face was pale, his breathing labored, but his eyes were sharp. You're right, he said finally. I'm thinking like a carpenter. You're thinking like a survivor. He leaned back on the cot, exhausted by the argument. Put it where you want. You're the one who has to teach it. It was the last time they disagreed about anything. Bernd died on the 19th of February. He went quietly in the early hours of the morning while Marit was sleeping in the berth. She woke to silence, not the normal silence of the ice house, but a different kind, a deeper kind, an absence that filled the room like water. She found him on the cot with his eyes closed and his hands folded across his chest. His face was peaceful. He looked like he was sleeping, except that he was not breathing, and when she touched his forehead, it was already cool. Marit sat beside him for a long time. She did not cry. The tears would come later, she knew, but in that moment she felt only stillness, a strange, hollow calm, like the moment after a storm passes and the world has not yet remembered how to move. She thought about everything he had taught her, the thread tied to the nail head, the flour dust on the floor, the difference between heating a room and slowing the loss of heat. She thought about his damaged hand and his dead wife, and the years he had spent waiting for something to matter. She had been that something. She knew that now. She had given him a purpose when he had none, and he had given her the knowledge to survive. It was not a fair trade. Nothing about death was fair, but it was a trade, and she was grateful for it. She closed his eyes with her fingers, the way her mother had taught her to do when she was very young. Then she went outside into the February dawn and began walking to town to tell someone that Bernd Assen was gone. The funeral was small. A minister came. A few people who remembered Bernd from his carpenter days. Marit stood at the edge of the grave and watched them lower the plain wooden coffin into the frozen earth. And she thought about the notebook in her pocket, the pages of careful handwriting that contained everything he had learned. When the grave was filled, Torsten Kvamme approached her. He was a good man, Torsten said. Troubled, but good. I'm sorry you lost him. I didn't lose him. Marit touched the notebook through the fabric of her coat. He's still here, in what he taught me. Torsten looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded slowly. I believe he is, he said. The ice house felt different without Bernd. Marit had grown used to his presence, the sound of his coughing, the creak of the cot when he shifted position, the way he would call out questions or suggestions while she worked. Now the silence was complete, broken only by the wind and the drip of meltwater and the small sounds of her own survival. She did not grieve the way she had grieved for her father. That grief had been sharp and sudden, a wound that bled for weeks. This grief was slower, deeper, more like the ache of a bone that had healed wrong. See, she felt it most in the moments when she wanted to ask Bernd something and remembered that he was not there to answer. But she did not stop working. The schoolhouse storm room needed finishing. Families were still asking for help with their cabins. The method was spreading, but it was spreading imperfectly, and mistakes were being made that could cost lives in the next bad storm. Marit went back to teaching the day after the funeral. The first test of her independence came in early March. A family named Hoagland had settled on a claim 4 miles north of the lake, and they had spent their first winter in a cabin so poorly built that the children had gotten frostbite twice. The father had heard about Marit's work and had sent word asking for help, offering to pay whatever he could. The Marit walked the 4 miles in snow that was still knee-deep in places. She found the Hoagland cabin exactly as she had expected: green lumber that had shrunk and cracked, chinking that had fallen out in chunks, a door that fit so poorly that daylight was visible around the edges. "Can you fix it?" the father asked. His name was Gunder, and he was younger than Marit had expected, maybe 25, with the desperate eyes of a man who had brought his family to a place that was trying to kill them. Marit walked around the cabin, examining the walls, testing the seams, looking for the places where cold was finding its way in. She thought about what Bernd would have said, what he would have done, how he would have approached the problem. Then she spoke. "I can teach you to fix it," she said. "The labor has to be yours. I'll show you what to do and why, but you have to do the work." "Why?" "Because I won't always be here. Because the next storm might come when I'm 4 miles away and can't help you. Because your children need a father who knows how to keep them warm, not a father who depends on someone else to do it." Gunder looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Show me," he said. She spent 3 days at the Hoagland farm. She showed Gunder how to mix clay and lime for chinking, how to press it into the cracks so it would hold through the freeze-thaw cycles of spring. She showed him how to hang a blanket inside the door, how to build a raised sleeping platform, how to position the stove so the heat would circulate instead of rising straight to the ceiling. She made him do every step himself while she watched. "You're pushing too hard," she said when he was stuffing sawdust into a wall crack. "The sawdust needs room to expand. If you pack it too tight, it loses its insulating power." "How do I know when it's right?" "Feel it." She guided his hand to the crack. "It should be firm but not solid, like bread dough, not like stone." He learned. They all learned eventually. Some faster than others, some with more mistakes, but they learned. And each person who learned became a teacher themselves, spreading the knowledge outward in widening circles. By the end of March, Marit had visited a dozen farms and taught as many people. She did not charge for the teaching. She remembered what Bernd had said about giving knowledge away, but she accepted food, supplies, small payments when they were offered. The accounting work for Lindgren continued. The ice house cooperative that she and Bernd had discussed was beginning to take shape in her mind. And then Knut came back. He came on a morning in early April, when the snow was finally beginning to melt, and the lake ice was growing dark and soft at the edges. He walked up the slope to the ice house with his hands in his pockets, and his face set in an expression that Marit could not read. "I need your help," he said. Marit did not move from the doorway. "With what?" "The cabin. The chinking is failing again. The door won't seal. Arne keeps getting sick, and Randy says it's because the room is too cold at night." He looked at her, and for the first time since their father had died, she saw something in his eyes that was not anger or contempt, something that looked almost like shame. I can't fix it myself. I've tried. It keeps getting worse. You threw me out of that cabin. I know. You told everyone I would freeze to death in this building. I know. You came to my door during the storm with your wife and your son, and I let you in, and you didn't even thank me. Canute was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, lower, rougher, as if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep. I was afraid, he said, afraid that if you succeeded, it would mean I was wrong about you, about everything. He looked at the ice house, at the building that had saved his family when his own cabin had failed. I was wrong about a lot of things. I'm not good at admitting that. No, you're not. Will you help me anyway? Marit thought about everything her brother had done, the cruelty, the theft, the public humiliation. She thought about the night of the storm, when she had opened her door to the people who had tried to destroy her. She thought about what Bernd had said. We're all connected. My warmth is your warmth if we share it right. I'll teach you, she said. But you do the work, and you help with the schoolhouse storm room when we're finished, and you never try to claim credit for something you didn't build. Canute's jaw tightened. She could see him fighting with himself, with his pride, with everything he had always believed about his place in the world. Fine, he said finally. I'll do it. The teaching was hard. Canute was not a natural student. He was impatient, proud, quick to argue and slow to listen. He wanted shortcuts, easy solutions, methods that would let him skip the difficult work. Marit refused to give them to him. The sawdust has to be dry, she said, watching him stuff damp material into a wall crack. Wet sawdust freezes. Frozen sawdust expands. Expanding ice cracks the seal you're trying to create. This sawdust isn't wet. Feel it. She grabbed his hand and pressed it against the material. That's moisture from the barn floor. You need sawdust that's been stored inside, away from the weather. Canute pulled his hand away. His face was red with frustration. How am I supposed to know all this? You make it sound so simple, but there's 1,000 details that can go wrong. Yes, there are. That's why you have to pay attention. Marit met his eyes. Every one of those details can kill your son. Is that worth learning? He did not argue after that. The work took 2 weeks. By the end of it, the Tveit cabin was tighter than it had ever been. The chinking was solid and well sealed. The door fit properly in its frame. A second blanket hung inside the entrance, creating an airlock that would hold heat during the opening and closing. The sleeping area had been rebuilt smaller and raised off the floor, with a cloth ceiling that trapped warm air above the beds. Randy cried when she saw it, not from sadness, from relief. The children will be warm, she said. Finally, they'll be warm. Marit looked at her brother, expecting some final resistance, some last attempt to reclaim his dignity by dismissing what she had done. But Canute was silent. He was looking at the cabin, his cabin, their father's cabin, as if seeing it for the first time. How did you know? He asked finally. How did you figure all this out? I had help. Marit thought about Bernd, about the notebook that still sat in her pocket, about the lessons that would outlive both of them. And I was willing to learn from people who knew more than I did. Canute nodded slowly. It was not an apology. It was not forgiveness. But it was something. A crack in the wall between them, a space where something else might eventually grow. The secondary crisis came without warning. It was late April, the kind of day when spring seemed finally, truly present. The snow had melted. The lake ice had broken up and drifted away. Wildflowers were beginning to appear in the meadows, and the air smelled of mud and growth and possibility. Then the fever came. It started with the Svensson children, 3 siblings who had all fallen ill within a day of each other. And then it spread to the Gerda farm, where Eli and 2 of her brothers took to their beds with temperatures that made their mothers weep. Then it reached Watertown itself, filling the doctor's office with terrified parents and sweating children. Marit heard about it from Marte, who appeared at the ice house door with panic in her eyes. "Eli," she said, "she's burning up. The doctor says there's nothing he can do except keep her cool and pray." Keep her cool. The words hit Marit like a revelation. "The ice house," she said. "The lower vault. It's been holding ice since we refilled it last month. The temperature down there is still near freezing." Marte stared at her. "You want to put my daughter in an ice house?" "Not in the vault, but we can bring the cold up. Pack ice around wet cloths. We use the temperature difference to draw the fever down." Marit was already moving, pulling on her coat, grabbing the tools she would need. "It's the same principle as keeping the heat in, just reversed." "Will it work?" "I don't know." Marit met her eyes. "But it's better than praying and watching." The next 3 days were a blur of ice and fever and desperate hope. Marit set up a station in the upper room of the ice house where the temperature was cool but not dangerous. She brought Eli there, wrapped in blankets that she then removed layer by layer as the girl's body heat climbed. She packed ice chips around the girl's wrists and ankles, places where the blood ran close to the surface. She soaked cloths in ice water and laid them across the burning forehead. The temperature dropped. Not by much. Fever was stubborn, resistant, or determined to burn, but by enough. Eli's cheeks lost some of their terrible flush. Her breathing eased. Her eyes, which had been glassy and unfocused, began to clear. Other families came. The Svensson parents brought their 3 children, huddled together on a pallet in the corner of the room. A widow named Torbjör arrived with her grandson, a boy of 4 who was so hot his skin felt like a stoveplate. Marte brought her other children when they fell ill, adding them to the growing crowd of small bodies and worried faces. Marit worked without stopping. She hauled ice from the vault until her arms ached. She soaked and re-soaked cloths until her hands were raw and red. She watched the thermometer readings, tracking each small victory, each tiny drop in temperature that meant another child was pulling back from the edge. She did not sleep. She barely ate. When Randy arrived to help, Randy, who had never spoken a kind word to her before the storm, she nearly collapsed from gratitude. "How did you know to do this?" Randy asked, pressing a fresh cloth to Eli's forehead. "I didn't." Marit's voice was hoarse from exhaustion. "I just thought about what the building could do, what it was designed for, and I tried to use it. Bernd would be proud." The words hit her harder than she expected. She turned away so Randy would not see her face. "I hope so," she said. The fever broke on the 4th day. Not for everyone, 2 of the Svensson children were still fighting, and the widow's grandson remained dangerously hot. But Eli was sitting up by noon, asking for water and bread, her eyes clear, and her skin merely warm instead of burning. Marte wept openly, holding her daughter against her chest, rocking back and forth the way she had on the day after the storm. "You saved her," she said. "Again. You saved her again." "The building saved her. I just figured out how to use it." "Don't!" Marte's voice was fierce. "Don't do that. Don't pretend this was the building, or the method, or some trick you learned from Bernd. This was you, your knowledge, your work, your choice to help when you could have turned us all away." She reached out and gripped Marit's hand. You are the reason my daughter is alive. Accept that. Marit looked at Eli, at the color returning to her cheeks, at the life that had been preserved through cold and care and desperate improvisation. She thought about her father, who had died trying to help a neighbor with the harvest. She thought about Bernd, who had spent his last months teaching her everything he knew. She thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who helped, even when it cost her. Okay, she said quietly. I accept it. The fever passed by the end of the week. All of the children recovered, even the ones who had seemed closest to death. The ice house had become, for a few desperate days, a kind of hospital, a place where the cold that everyone feared had been transformed into medicine. Word spread, as it always did. By May, people were talking about the Tavite girl differently, not as the crazy woman who lived in an ice house, not as the sister Knut had thrown out, but as someone who knew things that could save lives, someone worth listening to. Marit did not seek the attention. Well, so she did not make speeches or hold demonstrations or try to convince anyone of anything. She simply did the work that needed doing, answered the questions that came to her, and taught whoever wanted to learn. The Ice House Cooperative took shape through the spring and summer. She and Torsten and Marte organized the refilling of the vault with fresh lake ice, stacked and packed and covered with sawdust against the summer heat. Farmers began bringing butter and cream and meat, storing it in the cold darkness where July could not reach. The building that had been designed to preserve ice was preserving food now, feeding the community that had once mocked the woman who lived inside it. And through it all, Marit kept Bernd's notebook close. She read it at night, by lamplight, tracing the careful handwriting with her fingers. She memorized the diagrams. She studied the calculations. She made notes of her own in the margins, adding what she had learned to what he had known, building a record that would outlive them both. He had given her the knowledge. She would give it to everyone else. Knut came to the ice house one morning in late June. He did not come to argue or threaten or demand. He came with his sleeves rolled up and a question on his face. The schoolhouse storm room, he said. You said I had to help when we finished the cabin. I'm here to help. Marit looked at him for a long moment. Then she handed him a shovel. We're building the foundation today, she said. Start digging. He dug. He did not complain. And when the work was finished, when the storm room was framed and sealed and ready for the next bad winter, he stood beside his sister and looked at what they had built together. I still don't like you, he said. I know. But I respect what you've done. He turned to face her. I won't try to take credit. I won't tell people this was my idea. It's yours. All of it. It was the closest thing to an apology she would ever get from him. She decided it was enough. The summer of 1888 brought heat that baked the prairie brown and sent farmers to the ice house vault with desperate eyes. Marit had not expected this. She had prepared for winter, for cold, for storms, for the kind of weather that had almost killed her, but summer brought its own crises. Butter melting before it could reach market, milk souring within hours of the milking, meat that had to be eaten immediately or thrown to the dogs because there was no way to keep it cold enough to last. The ice house changed that. By July, Marit had organized a rotation. Families brought their perishables to the vault on Monday mornings and retrieved them on Saturday afternoons. The ice that had been cut from Lake Campeska in February was still holding, insulated by layers of sawdust and the thick walls that kept summer from reaching it. Butter stayed firm. Milk lasted 3 days instead of 1. Meat could be aged properly, developing flavor instead of rot. She did not charge much. A few cents per family, enough to cover the cost of maintaining the building and replacing the sawdust that broke down over time. But the value was enormous. Families that had always eaten fresh or eaten spoiled now had options. When the community that had nearly lost children to winter cold was now being fed by summer cold, the ice house had become something more than a shelter. It had become infrastructure. Tolif Nesheim arrived with a wagon load of cream on a Thursday morning in August. He was a teamster, 31 years old, with the broad shoulders and careful hands of a man who had spent his life moving heavy things from one place to another. His wife had died 3 years earlier in the same fever outbreak that had taken Bernt's wife, and he had been raising his 2 daughters alone ever since. Marit had seen him before, hauling supplies through town, delivering goods to the farms around the lake, but they had never spoken. Now he stood at the door of the ice house with 6 cans of cream on his wagon and a question on his face. "The Lindgren farm sent me," he said. "They said you could keep this cold until Saturday." "I can." Marit looked at the cream cans, calculating the space they would need in the vault. "Help me carry them down." They worked together in silence, lifting the heavy cans and maneuvering them down the ladder into the cold darkness below. The vault was nearly full now, stacked with buttercrocks and wrapped meat and covered pails of milk, but there was room for 6 more cans if they arranged things carefully. "You built all this?" Tolif asked when they emerged into the August heat. "I had help. A man named Bernd Assen. He taught me how the building worked." "I knew Bernd." Tolif wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Good carpenter, bad drinker. Better man than most people gave him credit for." "Yes." Marit felt the familiar ache of loss, dulled now by time but still present. He was. Tolif looked at the ice house, at the cleared paths and the repair door and the small improvements that 6 months of work had made. His expression was thoughtful. "The Lindgren cream needs to go to Watertown on Saturday," he said. "I'll be back to pick it up. If you need anything hauled between now and then, let me know." He climbed onto his wagon and drove away without waiting for a response. Marit watched him go, feeling something she could not quite name. Not attraction. She was too tired and too focused for attraction. But recognition. The sense of having met someone who understood work the way she understood it. Tolif came back on Saturday, as he had promised. He came back the following Thursday with more cream. He came back the Thursday after that with butter, and a question about whether the vault could hold cheese. Each time they worked together in silence, developing a rhythm that required no words. By September he was coming twice a week. By October, he was staying for coffee after the work was done. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened in the spaces between labor. They talked about the farms they served and the families they knew. They talked about the weather and the roads and the price of ice in Watertown. They talked about his daughters, who were 7 and 9, and about how hard it was to raise children alone. They did not talk about feelings. They did not need to. The feelings were visible in the way Tolif checked the door hinges without being asked, in the way Marit saved the warmest coffee for his visits, in the way their hands sometimes brushed when they were lifting a heavy crate and neither of them pulled away. One evening in late October, as the sun was setting and the first frost of autumn was settling over the lake, Tolif said something that changed everything. "My daughters need a mother," he said. He was looking at the lake, not at her. "And I need—" He stopped, started again. "I need someone who understands, who knows what it's like to build something from nothing, who won't look at this ice house and see something crazy." "What do you see?" Marit asked. "I see the smartest thing anyone on this lake has ever done." He turned to face her. "I see someone I want to know better, if she'll let me." Marit thought about everything she had been through, the expulsion from her home, the months of cold and fear, the night of the storm when she had opened her door to the people who had tried to destroy her. She thought about what it would mean to let someone in again, to trust again, to build something with another person instead of building it alone. I'll let you, she said. The second winter tested everything. It came early in late November, with temperatures that dropped faster than anyone expected. The families who had learned from Marit were ready, their vestibules built, their sleeping alcoves sealed, their sawdust packed, and their drains cleared. But the families who had not learned, who had dismissed the methods as unnecessary or too much trouble, found themselves facing the same old battle with the cold. Knut was among them. He had done the work on his cabin in the spring. You're following Marit's instructions, sealing the gaps and building the airlock and creating the small, tight sleeping space that would hold heat through the worst nights. But he had not maintained it. The sawdust had gotten damp over the summer, and he had not replaced it. The chinking had cracked in the autumn freeze-thaw cycles, and he had not repaired it. The blanket over the door had torn, and he had simply left it hanging, thinking the damage too small to matter. By December, the damage mattered. The cold found every gap he had ignored. The damp sawdust froze and expanded, cracking seals he thought were solid. The torn blanket let heat escape every time someone passed through, and the drafts that followed were constant and merciless. When the first real storm of winter hit, Knut's cabin failed again. He came to the ice house on a morning after the storm, with Randy and Arne behind him and his face the color of ash. The stove wasn't enough, he said. His voice was flat, defeated. We burned everything we had, chairs, a table, the frame from the bed, and it still wasn't enough. Arna's fingers turned white before dawn. Marit looked at her nephew, at the small hands wrapped in cloth, at the fear in his eyes. Then she looked at her brother. You didn't maintain it, she said. I know. I taught you what to do. I showed you every step, and you let it fall apart because you thought it didn't matter. I know. Knut's voice cracked. I was wrong. I'm always wrong. I don't know how to do this, Marit. I don't know how to keep them safe. For a moment she felt the old anger rise up, the fury at everything he had done, everything he had taken, everything he had tried to destroy. She could have turned him away. She could have made him beg, the way he had promised to make her beg. She could have taken her revenge in public, in front of the whole community, humiliating him the way he had humiliated her. But she thought about Arne's white fingers. She thought about Randy's terrified eyes. She thought about what Bernd had said. My warmth is your warmth if we share it right. Come inside, she said. We'll warm them up, and then you're going to learn how to maintain what you built. And this time, you're going to actually do it. The repair work took a week. Marit made Knut do every step himself, with witnesses. Torsten Kvame came to watch. Marte Gerda came. Eric Lindgren came with his oldest son. They stood in the cold and watched Knut Tveit, the man who had thrown his sister out, the man who had mocked her survival, the man who had taken their father's house, crawl on his hands and knees to pack sawdust into the gaps he had ignored. They watched him replace the torn blanket with a new one, carefully measuring the overlap, carefully sealing the edges. They watched him check every seam in the chinking, filling the cracks with clay and lime, while Marit stood over him and corrected his technique. They watched him rebuild the sleeping alcove, making it smaller and tighter, raising the platform higher off the cold floor. When he was finished, he stood in the center of his cabin and looked at the faces watching him. I was wrong, he said. His voice was hoarse, and Marit could see what the words were costing him. About the ice house. About my sister. About all of it. She saved my family twice. I owe her a debt I can't repay. No one spoke. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and complete. Then Torsten Kvame stepped forward. We all owe her, he said. Every one of us who learned from her. Every child who survived a fever. every family that kept their butter through July. He looked at Marit, and in his eyes was something she had never expected to see: admiration. She's not crazy. She's not foolish. She's the reason half this community is still alive. The others nodded. Marte, Eric, the farmers and widows and hired hands who had come to watch Knut's humiliation and had found something else instead. They had found community, built on cold, sealed against the weather, maintained by people who understood that survival required constant work. Dakota became a state in November of 1889. By then, Marit and Tollef had been married for 3 months. The ceremony was small: a minister, a few friends, Tollef's 2 daughters standing solemnly beside their father as he said his vows. They built a house near the ice house, close enough that Marit could walk to the vault in 2 minutes, far enough that she could come home to something that was truly hers. The ice house operation had grown beyond anything she had imagined. 36 families now used the vault for storage. The schoolhouse had a storm room that could hold 50 people. Every farm within 5 miles had some version of the improvement she had taught: vestibules, sleeping alcoves, sawdust insulation, controlled vents, and people were teaching each other now. Marit did not have to visit every cabin herself. The knowledge had spread person to person, family to family, until it had become simply the way things were done. That was the victory she had not expected. Not survival, though survival had been the first and hardest step. Not respect, though respect had come eventually. But the knowledge itself, living on, growing, changing, adapting to new situations and new challenges. Bernd had been right. Knowledge was meant to be shared, and shared knowledge could not be killed. The years compressed after that. Tollef's daughters grew up calling Marit mother. She had 3 more children of her own, 2 boys and a girl, and raised them all in the house by the lake, while the ice house hummed with activity behind them. Winters came and went. Some were mild. It's barely testing what the community had built. Others were brutal, driving temperatures to 30 below and piling snow in drifts that reached the rooftops. But the storm rooms held. The sleeping alcoves stayed warm. The methods Marit had taught became tradition, passed from parents to children like recipes or prayers. She kept teaching until her hands grew too stiff to demonstrate the work. Then she taught by talking, sitting in a chair while younger people did the labor, correcting their technique, answering their questions, sharing the hard-won knowledge that had kept her alive. The notebook stayed with her, Bernd's handwriting and her own, intertwined on the pages, a record of everything they had learned. When her oldest son turned 14, she gave it to him and made him memorize every page. This is not just information, she told him. This is survival. Treat it that way. Knut died in the winter of 1912. He was 57 years old, worn down by decades of hard work and harder pride. His cabin, the cabin that had been their father's, the cabin he had thrown Marit out of, had become one of the best maintained buildings on the lakeshore. He had learned finally what it meant to keep something instead of just taking it. Marit went to his funeral. She stood at the edge of the grave, an old woman now with white hair and hands that ached in the cold, and she watched them lower her brother into the frozen earth. She did not cry, but she did not feel triumph either. "He tried," Tollef said beside her, his voice quiet. "At the end, he tried." "I know." Marit thought about the years of teaching Knut had done after his humiliation, the families he had helped, the repairs he had made. It wasn't enough to erase what came before, but it was something. That's all any of us can do. Try to make the end better than the beginning. She took her husband's hand and held it while the minister spoke. Around them, the community that had grown up in the shadow of the ice house stood silent, remembering a man who had been cruel and had learned to be kind. It was not redemption, but it was change. And change, Marit had learned, was the most you could hope for from anyone. The last years were quiet. Marit stopped making the walk to the ice house when she turned 70. Her joints ached too much. Wisha and the slope had become treacherous for feet that no longer moved with confidence. But she could see the building from her window, could watch the families coming and going, could track the seasons by the rhythm of ice cutting and storage and retrieval. Tolliff died in 1918 in the same influenza epidemic that killed millions across the world. By then they had been married for 30 years, and his absence felt like losing a limb, but she had survived worse losses. She had survived her father and her brother and Bernd, and the winter that should have killed her. She could survive this too. Her children took over the ice house operation. Her grandchildren learned the methods. The notebook, copied now into 3 separate volumes, was distributed among the family so that no single loss could destroy the knowledge it contained. She had built something that would outlast her. Not a building. Buildings rotted and fell. Not a method. Methods were adapted and changed. But a way of thinking, an approach to survival that started with understanding and ended with sharing. That was her legacy. Not the ice house itself, but everything that had grown from it. Marit Tveit-Nesheim died on a February morning in 1924. She was 80 years old. She had outlived her father by 37 years, her mentor by 36, her brother by 12, her husband by 6. She had seen Dakota become a state, seen the frontier become farmland, seen the world change in ways that would have been unimaginable to the 19-year-old girl who had broken into an abandoned ice house with nothing but $9 and a quilt. She died in her bed, what in the house she had built with Tolliff, with her children and grandchildren gathered around her. Outside the window, Lake Kampeska was frozen solid, the same lake that had provided the ice that had saved her life and so many others. Her last words were practical, as her words had always been. "Check the vent," she said. "It's been too warm. The air will go bad." Her oldest son checked the vent. The air was fine, but he checked it anyway because that was what she had taught him to do. Within a decade of Marit's death, 47 families in Codington County had adopted some version of the method she had taught. The number was difficult to count precisely because the techniques had become so common that people no longer thought of them as special. Vestibules were standard. Sleeping alcoves were normal. See, sawdust insulation was simply how you built a warm room. One specific detail survived longer than any other: the rope lines that connected houses to barns, strung across yards throughout the county, waiting for the next whiteout that would make the distance deadly. Marit had not invented them. The practice was older than Dakota itself, but she had insisted on them, had helped string them, had taught children to find them by feel when their eyes were useless. Those lines saved lives for 50 years after she was gone. Marit Tveit-Nesheim spent her entire adult life within sight of Lake Kampeska. She never traveled more than 30 miles from the shore where her father had built his cabin and her brother had tried to destroy her. She did not need to travel. Everything she cared about was there: her family, her work, her community, and her purpose. In her later years, she was known less for the night of the storm than for the rooms she taught others to build. People came to her for advice about construction, about maintenance, about the small details that made the difference between survival and death. She answered every question, corrected every mistake, and never charged more than a meal or a handshake. The morning she died, the temperature was 6 degrees above zero, cold, but not dangerous. Snow was falling lightly, the kind of soft, quiet snow that blankets the world in white without threatening to bury it. Through the window of her bedroom, she could see the old ice house on the slope above the lake, its loading door weathered but solid, its walls still holding after nearly 40 years. The building she had chosen when every other choice was closed to her. The building everyone said would kill her. It was still standing, and so was everything that had grown from it. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, Torsten Kvama had told her the truth as he understood it. Sleep one night in that ice house and they'll carry you out stiff before dawn. He had been certain. He had been experienced. He had seen winter kill too many people to believe that a 19-year-old girl with $9 and no stove could survive in a building designed to store ice. But when the blizzard of January 12th broke across Dakota Territory with the speed and violence of a biblical plague, when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in a matter of hours, when the wind drove snow so fine and fierce that men froze 10 feet from their own doors, when all of that came, they did carry people through that door. They carried in a 7-year-old girl whose breath had gone thin and whose lips had turned blue on the road between her mother's farm and the schoolhouse. They carried in a woman with snow frozen into her shawl and a toddler pressed against her chest. They carried in a brother who had trusted a leaking cabin more than a strange building on the hill, and who had found himself begging for shelter from the sister he had thrown out into the cold. Inside, the lamp burned above Marit's quilt curtain. Frost crusted the outer planks. The inner boards stayed dark and merely cold, not frozen, not deadly. The room built to keep summer from reaching ice had kept death from reaching the people huddled within it. The prediction had been wrong, not because Torsten was foolish, but because he had not imagined what Marit could see, that the same principles that preserved cold could preserve warmth if you understood them well enough. Dawn came over Lake Campeska on the morning of January 13th. The storm had passed. The world was white and silent and still, and from the vent slit of the old ice house, barely visible against the gray sky, a thread of warm breath escaped into the frozen air. No one laughed at it anymore.